Yes. We begin this panel on longing and belonging kinship communities. Our first speaker would be Sabiha Allouche, who's a PhD candidate at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, and she would be speaking about As Long as They Get Off My Back, Strategic Queer Marriages, Queer Kin and Desire in Lebanon. May I please welcome Sabiha? Yeah.
Well, hello everyone. My paper title has slightly changed, but it does still resonate very much with the, what the conveners know, what the chair said. Now it is named Queering Hetero Love in Contemporary Lebanon, Marriage and the Non-Queerness of Homo Desire. Lots of big words, but I think it will make sense once I go through with the paper. So, like many of its Middle Eastern neighbors, Lebanon is no exception when it comes to widespread assumptions related to sex, sexuality, and gender. Lebanon is often recounted in the popular imagery, both regionally and globally, as a haven of sexual tolerance where sex is rampant and sex segregation is inexistent. What's more, its capital Beirut is often portrayed as Tel Aviv's successor in terms of LGBT rights in the region. Lebanon's sexy image is often reiterated at the most official level, seeing the sexist nature and depth of the male gaze that accompanies the advertising campaigns of the country's Ministry of Tourism. Add to it Western media and travelers' anecdotal emphasis on Lebanon's obsession with consumerism, body modifications, and its nightlife. At the same time, Lebanon is ranked among the worst countries in the world in terms of gender equality, and arrest of men suspected of sodomy or sex with other men happen regularly. I am constantly on alert when engaging with sex and sexuality narratives from the MENA region, MENA, Middle East, and North Africa, in the sense that I am constantly wary of the Orientalist trope of exceptionalizing them, as has been the case in recent works on sex and gender in the region. My position can overall be summed up in the words of Riwa Sayer, who states, quote, "Many of the global discourses around gender and sexuality in the region, Middle East region, create a sense of exceptionalism when dealing with local feminists, queer women, and LGBT identities, especially when they intersect with other marginalized identities. We are automatically perceived as challenging or transgressing the status quo. While this might or might not always be the case, a plain reading of what local communities do or should do reflects a very narrow vision of the tropes of gender and sexuality in our countries." End quote. So working against such a background, in this paper I juxtapose what I call strategic queer marriages with non-conventional love stories, in order to argue that heterosexual love in Lebanon is a most queer affect. In addition, I will invite us to think about the limits of theory in accounting for uninterrupted heteronormativity, especially when it occurs in mundane and non-assuming spaces. Before I define what I mean by strategic queer marriages and non-conventional love stories, I want to share some notes on methodology. So I conducted a year-long fieldwork in urban Lebanon where I interviewed dozens of cis heterosexual couples, both jointly and separately. The aim of the fieldwork was to trace the timeline of heterosexual love in contemporary Lebanon. And my fieldwork informed me that whereas love experimentation, including dating partners from different sects and religions, is abundant during late adolescence and years spent at university, most couples had to abandon such desires at the time of marriage and marry someone with similar sectarian or religious affiliations. Marriage then becomes an institution that replicates desire within strict sectarian or religious frames. And to borrow from Elizabeth Freeman, getting married is a mostly chrononormative practice that, quote, uses time and organizes individual human bodies toward maximum productivity, in addition to making people feel coherently collective through particular orchestrations of time. Now, end quote. Now, during my fieldwork, I came across instances of strategic queer marriages by chance. They were not on the menu per se, as my interest laid primarily in examining gendered power relations in the context of heterosexual love. Still, And despite the limited cases I examined, the puzzling nature of strategic queer marriages, with which I elaborate hereafter, make them perfectly suitable to address, especially when contemplating the limits of what can, cannot, should, could, or not be understood as queer in the Lebanese context and other similar contexts. Another note on methodology is regarding my use of the notion of sect. Now, in this paper, I will use sect and religion almost interchangeably. This is a deliberate exercise, a shortcut of the sort, which allows me to reach the largest number of my audience without entering into the details of sectarian sociopolitics. Of course, if you're interested, we can address it more in details in the Q&A, or please feel free to speak to me later. And yeah, I will skip the theoretical discussion of that. Having said that, I will now define each of non-conventional heterosexual love with strategic queer marriages in order to show ultimately what I mean when I say that love is best understood as a queer affect, even in a heterosexual context in Lebanon. So I define non-conventional heterosexual love as love stories that do not result in marriage because of the distinct sectarian or religious affiliation of man and woman. So sectarian affiliation, or the specific sect that dictates personal laws that are related to marriage, custody, inheritance, and death, played a direct role in the dissolution of a number of love stories, according to my interlocutors. And most of them agreed, in retrospect, that non-conventional intersectarian or interreligious love is a headache, in addition to being both irresponsible and irrational. As such, the reiteration of love as a space of excess, irrationality, and irresponsibility in Lebanon is necessary for the production of love marriage, or the intra-religious love that is based on choice as the preferred and socially accepted type of love. As for strategic queer marriages, I define them as the legal union between self-identified queer men and women in Lebanon who actually seek each other's and decide to marry and ultimately perform heteromarriage in order to serve personal interests and escape kin pressure, all the while pursuing same-sex desire elsewhere. Now, strategic queer marriages bring forth China's recently documented wave of, please excuse my Chinese, Tonghun, or homo marriage, and Xinghun, cooperation marriage, which have been labeled by Western media as sham marriage, which is a misnomer in my opinion. The labeling of such marriages as sham in mainstream Western popular culture assumes love to be universal, in addition to reiterating it as a quintessential prerequisite for marriage. And through the reiteration of love as free from, immigration officers, for example, have the perfect alibi to clamp down on unions that are deemed devoid of love. Moreover, the conflation of love with marriage obliterates the many factors that contribute to marital unions, as we know from the wide literature that explores the political economy of love in many southern contexts, from kin alliances to social mobility, parental wishes, or accepted moral discourses. Another familiar practice in the Asian context is heterosexual convenience marriages in India, for example, which have been widely researched by Pervez Modi. So, where is the puzzle? The puzzle is strategic queer marriages could be seen as a smart move that circumvents the hostility of Lebanon's legal system towards LGBTQ desire. In the 8 cases I have come across since my fieldwork, the marriage was conducted in a mostly sectarian normative fashion, with either wife or husband converting to the other person's sect or religion when necessary. By getting married, the couple is capable of displaying a facade of domestic bliss while pursuing same-sex desire elsewhere. Now, strategic queer marriages ought not be confused with MSM, or men who have sex with men, at least as far as the documented literature allows me to argue, since both self-identified queer men and women strategically builds an environment that can accommodate their desire. Unsurprisingly, several complexities and contradictions emerge from instances of strategic queer marriages. Should we see them as an act of resistance, a subversion, or perhaps something else altogether, especially when we juxtapose them with the heterosexual non-conventional desire that does not result in marriage? Is there anything queer at all about strategic queer marriages when they reproduce Lebanon's highly structured institution of marriage? Isn't it fair to argue that heterosexual non-conventional love itself is the more queer of the two, especially since it destabilizes the very fabric of Lebanese society when they breach the limits of intra-sectarian desire? What about the gender component of each? Despite their convenience, how are wives positioned in relation to the husband in the context of each, etc.? Now, when we approach such questions theoretically, it is clear that heteronormativity and heterosexuality are not co-constitutive of each other. I explain. Non-conventional heterosexual love, despite it challenging interreligious boundaries and including sectarian others, remains temporal, in addition to operating outside the confines of the institution of marriage, the quintessential pillar that holds Lebanon's socio-religious fabric. At the same time, strategic queer marriages territorializes the institution of marriage, despite its exclusionary nature, seeing how it organizes the Lebanese demographic according to sect, class, and so on. Also at the theoretical level, when we think about queer in the context of Lebanon, we cannot think about it from a purely sexuality lens. Recent critical works in queer studies teach us that an LGB or T label does not necessarily entail a life that is lived at the margin. Many hetero-identities, including examples of non-conventional heterosexual love, find themselves marginalized whenever they engage in anti-establishment politics, even in a space as mundane and taken for granted as a couple dating. In other words, one could very much be hetero and queer in as much as one could be LGBT or else and not queer. My understanding of a queer identity is one that challenges the fundamental foundations of the racial, gendered, capitalist, and white structures that inform modern life, in addition to recognizing and calling out heteronormative practices. As the wonderful Yasmin Nair puts it, quote, queer organizing used to be about dismantling economic structures of privilege and redefining structures of kinship in ways that straights have since embraced. Somewhere along the way, we, or rather the increasingly powerful gay organizations that speak for us and articulate our agenda, have decided that we want to expand, not destroy, privilege. End of quote. So in the context of Lebanon, the increasingly powerful gay organizations can be seen in the interplay between Lebanon's neoliberal economy and the Lebanese state. The gay-friendly Lebanon, compared to its Arab neighbors, helps propagate the image of Lebanon as an exception, in the same fashion that its Ministry of Tourism relies on visuals that are heavily saturated with the male gaze. However, and as Sahar Mandoor has shown, there are limits to this gay friendliness whenever it collides directly with the interest of the state. Furthermore, the powerful gay organizations bring forth the work of Joseph Massad, who argues, one of the more compelling issues to emerge out of the gay movement in the last 2 decades is the universalization of gay rights. This project has appropriated the prevailing US discourse on human rights in order to launch itself on an international scale. Following in the footsteps of the white Western women's movement, which had sought to universalize its issues through imposing its own colonial feminism on the women's movements in the non-Western world, a situation that led to major schisms from the outset, the gay movement has adopted a similar missionary role. End quote. Of course, and whereas I agree with Massad on this point, his argument leaves little to no room for the agency of self-identified gay and lesbians in Lebanon, particularly those activists who distance themselves from the NGOization or imperializations of sexuality in the region, if we are to follow Massad. How long do I have? Okay, I'm concluding actually. In the end, I hope that the paper has shown that our understanding of the queer ought not be associated strictly with the sexual identity in the context of Lebanon, and more broadly in further societies in Asia. Equally important is to contemplate whether theory can serve us in this regard. Perhaps a more intelligible analysis is one that scouts the ground by showing how heteronormativity is interrupted on a daily basis in the most mundane spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabiha. I would now invite Zhenzhong, a PhD candidate from King's College, London, speaking on gay fandom of Chinese opera, queering cross-gendered performance, sisterhood, and intimacy.
Yeah, you can stand here to present. Which one is it? This one?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Wait, I think you can. It's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Good. My presentation is titled "The Gay Fandom of Your Opera: Queering Cross-Gendered Performance, Sisterhood, and Intimacy." It's going to reflect on how gay fans of your opera negotiate with the notion of intimacy within their community formed in rural regions of Yangtze River Delta area in southern China. Your opera, since its emergence in rural Zhejiang province in the late 19th century, has become the second most influential opera form in mainland China. The professional Your opera is performed by all-female tropes. However, it has gained groups of gay male fans in contemporary China, especially in southern China. Part of its appeal lies in its features that can be appropriated and queered, such as cross-gender performances, flamboyant costumes, colorful makeup, constant switches between singing and speaking, and so on. Many gay males into this cultural form like to claim that 99% of male opera fans are 同志, which means gay or queer comrades. Most of them picked up this cultural form since their childhood, and they're proud to be able to appreciate this traditional music for reasons varying from nostalgia, southern locality, to cultural 素质, which means the quality, aesthetic consumption, and so on and so forth. These gay fans have formed a community that is active both on and offline. I will firstly demonstrate how gay fans of your opera bonded with each other and strategize heteronormativity. Secondly, I'd like to argue that the gay fan community is not merely a space that protects the queerness, but simultaneously undermining it. Thirdly, I will take a review of their identities and offer to understand their queerness in relation to the complexity of their desires and libidos. I became an active member of this community since early 2016 and have conducted more than 20 interviews and joined 3 gay opera fan parties in 2016. Both experiences made me realize that these gay fans parties are regularly organized from spring to fall every year, and each one lasts 2 to 3 days. Parties' locations have to be very carefully selected. There have to be a public stage available for voluntary performances in front of rural seniors, a backstage room ready in which they paint their faces and try on their opera costumes, a cheap hotel booked close by where they rest or playfully spend the night, individually or otherwise, and presumably a roadside restaurant or vendor where they sit around tasting local flavors and drinking local light beers after a day of performances. During the daytime, they paint their faces and perform popular episodes and scenes of your opera. Between scenes, between front stage and backstage, they share an intimacy by physically touching or bantering with each other. After a day of voluntary performances, the street food vendor close by would be packed with gay fans. Throughout the dinner, they drink together with their pinky up and call each other beautiful little girls, older or younger sister, and other deliberately misused pronouns and terms in a dramatically operatic tone, such as 啊姑娘 or 啊姐姐妹妹, something like that. All of these rural gay men are closeted to their colleagues and families. Some of them are married to heterosexual women. With a shared passion in your opera, these gay men found a space where they managed to leave their straight marriage life, wives and children behind, and be who they want to be for several days. Through the mimicry of Yue opera artists, they find freedom when they put up female characters' costumes and win applause when move on the stage lightly and prudently in the name of art. At the backstage, they are allowed to gently touch each other on the lower back or the thigh, to bitch about celebrities, their lives, and other gay fans that perform less convincingly or simply worse on the stage. They feel relieved and relaxed in a community where they can gather, sing, and get encouraged, complimented, or even criticized over the art form that they love, and formed a sisterhood that cannot be even imagined at their workplace or in their marriage life. The sisterhood seems to function as a non-familial intimacy that helps to temporarily emancipate them from the enormous pressure of heterosexual marriage. However, when interviewed, most respondents claimed that being a father or a husband can also be appealing. Furthermore, when asked what kinds of life they fantasize the most, they still include a heterosexual marriage, a child, preferably a son, and healthy parents into that description. Though they're forced to live a dual life, and some of them found heterosexual marriage disenchanting, their perception of of the notion of family is never too negative. Without clubbing or fighting for gay rights, they are carefully balancing who they're supposed to be and who they want to be. I tended to ask my interviewees when interviews approached the end, if there's a magic button in front of you, by pushing which you would be sent to any time or space you choose, would you push it for better life as a gay man? These rural gay men hesitated before they finally refused to change anything. At this moment, some might think that the gay fan group is a community that efficiently preserves the intimacy between sisters. But the sweet bonding, friendship, or sisterhood is not the whole story. On the one hand, there are hierarchies between community members. Veteran members tend to enjoy more visibility and authority within the community. Moreover, there are overt conflicts of interests, competition for performing a better role on stage, and occasional oppositions between effeminate camp fans and straight acting fans. There are gay men who were reluctant yet forced to perform eunuchs or female servants throughout 3 parties simply because they were younger and new to the opera. Characters like a prince or a lady or a nice lady are almost limited to experienced fans. Hence, I see the gay fan community as a space not merely shielding the queerness from social norms such as heterosexual marriage, passing down the family line and so on, but simultaneously undermining it by holding on to homonormativity and other various forms of binaries. On the other hand, there are respondents who hope for fondles, cuddles, and even sex coming into my sight as the fieldwork continued. Eroticism becomes less covert when I began to know them better. I was invited to sleep on the same king-size beds in a local hotel by a gay fan, and was told by a few respondents when I was wrapping up their interviews that they were quite smitten with me. A gay man in Zhenzhong felt utterly disappointed that he travelled all the way to see me in absolutely early morning to do the interview, that he did not get the chance to have sex with me after. The sexualization of community members, including me as a researcher, and other respondents becomes increasingly overt. A young respondent even told me his experience of being raped by a much older Yue opera fan. It demonstrates an unexpected asymmetry between gay opera fans' expectations before joining this community and what this community bonding or sisterhood sometimes lead them to. This opera-loving rural gay man surprisingly showed how to enjoy a heterosexual family and a dissident identity at the same time. But being gay or tongzhi still remains a stigma in these rural areas. By living such an identity, they have internalized the stigma. So when I invited them to talk about sexuality, they kept using pronouns such as this thing, it, instead of homosexuality or gay or tongzhi. A closeted and straight-acting gay male is surely a bitter role that they have to perform for a longer life. They came from different places and gather on a party where they can whine about the heterosexual life and put up the most feminine costume with the hope to escape the bully by heteronormativity. But when they proudly posted their children's birthday pictures on WeChat or thanked their wife for an anniversary's present, they seem to unconsciously become the helper of the bully. When we are seeking for a point of balance between powerlessness and empowerment, these gay fans of opera discovered this community and use it as an important place where they try hard to maintain such balance. Within the community, these gay men are not judged for marrying a female. They celebrate the traditional cultural form and appropriate values conveyed or challenged by diverse opera scripts instead of pop stars or gay icons like Lady Gaga or Beyonce. By lingering on the old-fashioned Southern culture together, they built the non-familial intimacy with each other. Unlike those avant-garde queer artists or gay activists in the West or in Chinese cosmopolitan cities, rural gay fans are even less visible and are often overshadowed by Orientalism or an overarching Chineseness. They are rural, Southern, closeted, and almost left in the waiting room of history. Yet they are actively fluidizing their identities in relation to different intimacies to fulfill their desires and libidos in accordance with different cultural social contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zhenzhong. I will now invite Eliz Wong, Miriam, an MPhil in Multi-Disciplinary Gender Studies from the University of Cambridge, to speak about emerging democracy and LGBT movement in post-colonial Hong Kong.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eliz, and I'm a gender studies MPhil student at Cambridge. And my research topic is like that. I'm talking about emerging democracy and LGBT movement in Hong Kong. When we talk about LGBT and social movement, I'm sure everyone will think, oh, it's talking about LGBT movement. But how about why LGBT individuals can't participate in other social movements, just like labor movement, environmental movement, and democratic movement? So my research wants to study how LGBT participants in democratic movement in Hong Kong and using Hong Kong umbrella movement as a case study. So first is the theoretical framework. Public sphere suggested by Habermas have been heavily criticized by feminist scholars and also other scholars, talking about the nature of exclusion and also the status inequality are only blanket but not reduced or eliminated. Also, the hegemonic agenda setting of common goods, which exclude the marginalized groups such as LGBT people. So a lot of scholars suggest a concept called counter-public, which means that the subordinated social group group together to circulate counter discourse to formulate the oppositional interpretation of their identity, interests, and need. Also, more importantly, they want to challenge the normativity in the public, disturbing the dominant public discourse, and ask for changes. When start from Occupy Wall Street, there's a lot of scholars talking about, is it the Habermas public spheres idea can be realized in the Occupy movement, because thousands of activists gather together, but they have different social background, and they gather together to talk about common goods and also deliberate the movement. So is it public sphere can be formed? How about the critique on it? How about, are there any counter public formed, the exclusion, inclusion in this context? So my research question, first I want to study why did the sexual minority participate in Occupy movement, and how did LGBT counterparts constructed in the occupying zone, the interaction between the counter public and the dominant public sphere. So let me have a brief introduction of Hong Kong Umbrella Movement. It happened in 2014, and the main goal of Umbrella Movement is fighting for real democracy. We want to have a direct voting for our chief executive in Hong Kong, but the Beijing government refused to give us this democracy. So it happened in 2014. Upholding the principle of non-violence and also civil disobedience, so people use umbrella to protect themselves from pepper sprays and baton from the police. So this is why it's called umbrella movement. And the police use tear gas to want to disperse the protesters, but backfire happened and more protesters rush to the street and occupy the zone. And here is one of the occupying zone in Admiralty in Hong Kong in 2014. The whole movement lasts for 79 days, and from the public survey conducted by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, 21.1% of Hong Kong population participate in occupying movement, which can be calculated as 1.2 million Hong Kong people participate in umbrella movement. When we see the subgroup analysis of the participation, you can see that there is a clear generational shift. From the age group 18 to 29, 44% of us participate. It's nearly half of us participate in the umbrella movement. And the number dropped significantly. And there is another LGBT online survey with over 1,000 LGBT participants in this survey, and we can see that there's a lot of LGBT participants in umbrella movement. 62% in the age group of 16 to 29 of LGBT people participate in umbrella movement. So I know that these two surveys cannot be directly compared because one is representative public survey while one is low-ball sampling online survey. But I want to show that LGBT participation in umbrella movement is not a unique case of only one or two celebrity or activists. It's a considerate amount of LGBT participation in Occupy movement. But they are somehow invisible, and also they kind of need to struggle in the Occupy movement, although democratic movement is talking about liberation, equality, and freedom. I've adopted a mixed method research method. One is quantitative data analysis, while another one is qualitative with 14 in-depth interviews and also content analysis. So first, let us go into the LGBT plus community. We can see that the marginalized identities and also the discrimination experience can increase the awareness towards multiple oppression. Just like this quotation from a transgender woman, she said that as a transgender, some of my basic rights are exploited. Now my voting rights are also exploited by the adjusted government. The feeling of being oppressed and ignored are so strong, no matter it is related to my sexual identity or Hong Kong citizenship. All oppressions adjusted. And also, the veto of any discrimination ordinance public consultation by the government is the trigger point of LGBT participants to link their personal issues with a bigger political institutional problem. Because in 2012, the government refused to veto the bill to have a public consultation on the legislation of LGBT anti-discrimination ordinance. Although we already have a majority voting in the legislative council, but the unjust system make the vote is being vetoed. And within the LGBT community, we can see that there is an extensive mobilization within the group. The social group in LGBT community and also supported network are used to disseminate information about the umbrella movement. Also, most of my interviewees said that in the gay apps, just like Jack D or other gay apps, most of the profile pic changed to yellow ribbon, which is a symbol of umbrella movement. Even interviewees said that once I received a message in Jack D from a guy, he said, "I know I'm not your cup of tea and I'm not asking for a date, but please support umbrella movement, fight for democracy and our future together." So we can see that how the LGBT community are really involved in the umbrella movement. Also, the debate talk about how to engage between sexual minority issues and democratic movement, just like the anti-discrimination ordinance and also the same-sex marriage. Hong Kong, we do not have same-sex marriage and anti-discrimination ordinance on LGBT issues. So they link it, they bring the adjusted democratic system so that they persuade other LGBT people to participate in umbrella movement. We can see that the discussion is happened online in the lesbian forum, online forum, gay forum, and also offline. Just like they have a Hehe camp in the occupying zone, which I will talk it later. So after, we can see that the construction of counter-public had happened in the occupying zone, but how about the interaction between the counter-public and the dominant public sphere? Most of my interviewees said that actually the occupying zone are not a utopian. Activists from various backgrounds, it is too naive to believe that people who support democracy will support LGBT movement. But they have an extra concern in the movement setting. I did not talk about my sexual orientation and LGBT issues in occupying zone because I know it is controversy. Some people don't like it. Quarrels, especially in rational one, may trigger and is not good for the umbrella movement. For the sake of solidarity, we should avoid to talk about these controversial issues. Also, we can see that their self-protective strategy have adopted. Just like he said that my gay identity was not important. At that point, all of us were Hong Kong people. I won't talk about my sexual identity because I don't want people to think that we were too selfish and only care about our interests. I'm also a Hong Kong people. I care about Hong Kong. From his discourse, we can see that actually the critique on public sphere is still applied in occupying zone. First, the people talk about that the agenda setting of common goods. They think that talk about LGBT anti-discrimination ordinance, such like that is minority interest. So we should not propose this argument in the occupying zone. Otherwise, we will be considered as selfish and only care about our interests. Also, they do not conceal the sexual identity, but they highlight their Hong Kong identity, but downplay their sexual identity. It's just like the concept of government proposed covering, that they admit that they have the stigma, but they try their best to make that stigma not getting attention. So after the interpersonal level, let's talk about the movement level. It is encouraging that we can see the visibility of LGBT issue increased in Hong Kong umbrella movement from the start or from the creation of vocabulary Hehe, which is based or original from the Japanese culture boys love, which the people, mainly female, fantasizing two beautiful boys having romantic relationship together. And the vocabulary Hehe is localized in Hong Kong. It's combined with two pronouns he, signifies that there are two men, and then also its pronunciation is similar to the laughter in Cantonese. So they used there is a Facebook page with more than 30,000 likes and followers, framing two student leaders, Alex and Esther, as a romantic couples in umbrella movement. And we can see that there's thousands of creative work, just like painting, novel, comics, and video, and also I saw some of them to show that their intimate relationship, their romance happened in umbrella movement. And also with the endorsement of these two student leaders, these terms Hehe become visible in mass media. And also another significant point is that the Hong Kong Pride Parade in 2014 happened in Hong Kong umbrella movement occupying zone. 8,000 participants were holding rainbow umbrella, which is a symbol to combine rainbow thread and also umbrella to a march through to occupying zone with the slogan "No democracy, no equality." And also two student leaders, Alex and Esther, have attend the Pride Parade, and also the Hong Kong FS, the student leaders organization, have released a public statement saying that for democracy, for Big Love, Hong Kong Federation of Students with commerce in other issues will fight continuously for equality and freedom we deserved. So it seems like the situation is quite good that the visibility of LGBT issues increased in umbrella movement. However, backlash triggered. There is thousands of comments online after the Hong Kong FS have released their public endorsement on Hong Kong Pride Parade. They have several accusing LGBT community, such as they polluting the Hong Kong umbrella movement or they hijacking the democratic agenda. They accuse that the LGBT activists put the sexual minority issue into the democratic movement. So the strategy adopted by LGBT activists and also celebrity are quite similar to the individual one. This one is Ho Sisi, which is a very famous Asian female singer. She publicly came out in Hong Kong Pride Parade in 2012. And she actively involved in Hong Kong umbrella movement and also be selected by BBC 1000 female as the face of Hong Kong rebel and Hong Kong umbrella movement icon. But in her sharing, she said that Tongji identity is not important compared to other social issues. My Tongji identity is only a part of my private life. Before Tongji identity, there is still a lot of responsibility we need to take. So we can see that they also adopt the covering strategy that highlighting the unified collective identity, but downplaying their sexual identity and also the difference between the gay and sexual minority community. And even the discourse raised by LGBT participants and also activists saying no democracy, no equality. You can see that there is a priority. First, we fight for democracy, and then we can have equality. So the priority also starting that they downplaying the whole LGBT issues and identity. And also, there is some consequences to the LGBT community, just like the desexualization in Hehe culture. Because in Alex's Hehe image, only pure love accepted. They do not have intimate behavior. Even the creations of the novels or pictures, you can just see that they holding hands, hugging, but no sex. Definitely no. And we can see that there's a construction of new homonormativity that two student leaders, high educated, very handsome, have charisma, and they signify the whole LGBT community in Hong Kong. And also self-censor actions are triggered in occupying zone. It's like a lesbian share that we did not kiss in occupying zone, and of course no further intimate behavior, because it is a place for people to fight for democracy. It is not a place for us to play and have fun. But on the other hand, actually heterosexual couples are being glorified in Hong Kong umbrella movement and seeing that, oh, they're so romantic, fight for love and also democracy together. But LGBT community need to downplay their intimate relationship. So the conclusion is that we can see that a considerable LGBT population participate in Hong Kong umbrella movement, but their visibility is still overlooked. There is a construction of LGBT counter public and also the visibility of LGBT issues increase in occupying zone. But they want to challenge the heteronormativity discourse in dominant public sphere, which can be perceived as successful because the creation of Hehe culture and also the displays of body in Hong Kong Pride Parade. But coverings are still adopted that the LGBT participants highlight their Hong Kong identity for the sake of solidarity, so we do not talk about sexual identity. And assimilation approach we also need to be aware of. So here is my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliz. So now I have the difficult task to find the common thread between the papers, and it was a really fabulous experience reading all the three papers and also realizing how closely they relate to my own area of interest and research. I work with the Hijra communities in India. But before I plug my research in, let me, the angle from which I saw all the papers relating to the theme of the conference and also to each other was with the emergence of a new political kinship based on queer identities and the longing for belonging to a nation. Queerness in this context of nationalism then becomes a very ambiguous space, because I could see in all the three papers that, the division between the public and the private, and how they're blurring when the nation steps in the context of Sabiha's paper with, the Lebanese citizenship, and how this idea to have something which is acceptable in the Lebanese context by having a strategic marriage and passing, as a hetero becomes important. In the same way, in Zhenzhong's paper, the maintenance of Chineseness, when it comes to having a preference for a heterosexual marriage, or even a preference for a child and a male son, becomes important, and again, passing as hetero becomes important. And in Eliz's paper, the Hong Kong identity which takes over the gay identity, where it is also said that the gay identity is not important by one of the respondents. And it makes me wonder that, does queer become the new imagined political community, or how much heteronormativity is embedded in queer sexualities? And I would like to have a couple of questions. The first one is that how is being queer different from any of the LGBT identities, or could these words be used interchangeably, within the context of papers? Because most of the times it has been equated as either or nor, and also in one of the methodologies, a lot of the respondents identified as queer, and some identified as heterosexual, bisexual. So I was wondering, how could queerness be different, or is it almost always a part of, previously existing identity? And my second question would be about all the papers were trying to bring out maybe, the degrees of queerness that can be there. And I was wondering, are we, in a way then, introducing hierarchies, in queer spaces? What do we mean by being queer enough? And how do you think then that, intersectionalities between, inequalities and queerness be brought out in these contexts, right? And probably I'll first have the same order for response. Is that okay, Sabiha? Yeah? All right, Sabiha then.
Ina, I think you raise very interesting questions. I think they are massive questions. I think if we could say, here, what did I write? How does queerness differ, right, from pre-existent identities? I think that would be the solution, right, to all the dilemmas and, paradoxical problems, right, that we encounter in the literature today. But when you said that the last thing, what really popped for me is your last questions, is queerness a hierarchy? When I listened to our panel, I started thinking more and more about it as a spectrum of resilience, rebellion, anti-establishment, anti-politics, Yeah, but then again, like I don't know if it was clear in the paper. Maybe we should really move away, because clearly being able to live your sexual life, your desires, comfortably, happily, etc., is a matter of privilege. And this is what, prompts me to say that, maybe queerness should be thought of on a spectrum, from least less privilege to more privilege, etc. And obviously it will interact with other, socioeconomic practices, political discourses and all.
Thank you, Sabiha. Zhenzhong?
Well, to me, I think in this context, I think being gay and being queer are still quite different. For those interviewees and respondents, they were also married or divorced, and they used to conduct a heterosexual life in a traditional way. They either chose to break free from it, or I don't know, strategize it. I think that sort of creativity shouldn't be overshadowed by simply, categorizing them as gay. And when it comes to relation between queerness and hierarchies, I do believe there's such a thing called what's gayer than gays, then what's queer than queers, things like that. And I do believe that when coming into this community, coming to meet other gay opera fans and perform opera on a free stage, and cruising on the sites, it's sort of, I don't know whether I'm precise or not. I think it's sort of a relevant experience that can be quite similar to, for example, in the Western context, gay fans who are into musicals and other operatic products. So I think to me, yeah, there exists such kind of hierarchy: who's gayer, who's less gay, and stuff like that. And as I mentioned, even within the fields, you can see the difference between so-called cisgendered gays and effeminate gays, and how they interact with each other and things like that. But I believe queerness is not only a sort of category, but also this kind of dynamics between perhaps different identities and different powers, I'd say.
Thank you, Zhenzhong. Eliz?
Thank you so much for your comments and also your question. I think it is really inspiring, especially the first one is talk about what is acceptable or the creation of a new political identity. And I think maybe in my research that I would like to put the focus in the context of social movement, which makes the how what behavior are acceptable of, or what is the common goal for the social movement, and are they setting a higher moral standard for the activists in democratic movement which can exclude LGBT people. While and the second one, it makes me think a lot, is that being queer and being LGBT person, are they different? I'm sure that in Chinese context, especially in Hong Kong, is totally different, especially with the translation issues. The queer is translated in Hong Kong as 酷儿, 后裔, which is adapted from the Taiwan academic studies. But actually this does not have the meaning of queer in English context. We do not have the stigmatized context of embedded in queer, the term, and also this term is only limited in the academic institution. You can't say that you are queer in the LGBT community, or everyone will just rolling their eyes and give you a back face or something like that. So queer is just limited in the academic study that, after that we will use this as interpretations of the people identity. But LGBT plus is like, we usually have the terms 同志 as included all the LGBT community, but actually 同志 is from the gay community, and also it is generally perceived as only referencing homosexuality, especially male homosexuality. So we can see that there's still a marginalization of lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and other fluid sexual identity, especially with the creation of Hehe culture, which is used as the word to conclude represent LGBT community in Hong Kong society, especially in the mainstream media and also to the mainstream public. But Hehe is still referencing only gay men, and also with the homonormativity, very sunshine and very handsome guy. So we can see that there's still a lot of difference from it.
Thank you, Eliz. I now open the floor for question and answers. Do we have questions? Yes. So we would take 3 questions and then give a chance to the respondents.
Hello, I'm Eva from King's College London. I have a question for Eliz. Actually 2 questions, but okay, I will make it very short. The first one concerns methodology. I'm wondering, are you only interviewing umbrella movement participants in Admiralty? but not in Mong Kok and Causeway Bay, because there are several occupied zones in that movement. And people observe that the gender structure and the sense of sexual hierarchy in different zones are quite different. So, so you're basically basing in Admiralty, would that affect how your informants' performance of sexual identities, their strategies of covering, would there be any difference? And the second question concerns about the priority setting of democracy before equality. It seems that 3 years after the umbrella movement, it seems that quite a lot of people in Hong Kong are disillusioned that the democratic movement seems to be at deadlock. So if the democracy movement seems to be at deadlock, then how about LGBT movement? And do you, from your research, do you see any new strategies of reprioritizing, or any people feel just even more disappointed and the LGBT community just quit from the whole movement? So do you see the new changes? Thank you.
This what the two questions here?
Thank you to everybody. I'm Derek Hurd, University of Westminster. I have a question for Zhenzhong. You categorised your informants as southern and rural, and I just wonder to what extent they themselves used these terms when they thought of their own subjectivities, and to what extent they constructed a southern rural identity, which obviously involves a sexualized or queer aspect, in opposition to an urban, metropolitan, westernized kind of identity, and the sexualized connotations that involves. So there's a historical dimension, obviously, to the southern idea of the keeping the Chinese traditions going, in a sense, and so it's not just a geographical thing. There's a historical tradition of the South being the repository of Chinese-ness, in opposition, in contrast to foreignness. So just related to that, you did mention that there were young people involved here. So these this seems to be a cross-generational thing, then, which is so. What I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is this a kind of historical and geographical, a rural reconstruction of identity that young people are also attracted to, and it's not a simple question of an older generation of conservatives or whatever, and a younger generation of people looking to the West or whatever.
Okay, my question goes to Eliz. So you refer to Warner, actually, in his theorization of the counter-public. And Warner theory comes from a particular historical moment in queer theory where people sometimes refer to the so-called anti-social or anti-normative turn or strand in queer theory. And I still remember the shock in reading his article, Sex in Public, when he describes the erotic vomiting scene, which is apparently quite antagonistic to social norms, let alone to heterosexual social norms. However, in Hong Kong and in Asian context, a lot of people have argued that the type of antagonistic relationship towards social norms is not characteristic of the queer culture in Hong Kong, in China, etc. So how would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, and please reserve your questions for the next round. So I would reverse the order, and we start with these, and then if Sabiha wants to respond to any.
Okay, first answer your question. Thank you so much. They're so fascinating. The first one is talk about two occupying zone. Actually, there's three occupying zone in Hong Kong Umbrella Movement. One is Hamilton. It is in front of the government headquarters, while the Mongkok is more working class, localized occupying zone in Hong Kong. And my interviewees are both from Hamilton and also Mongkok. They also describe there is difference between these two occupying zones, because in Hamilton, the whole atmosphere is talking about how pure, how moral superior of the activists, just like the students reading books, sleeping the floor, keeping everything clean, to show that they have a very positive image of the umbrella movement. While Mongkok is more military, they want to fight for democracy. They really use shield and also other things to fight against the police. But the same pattern I can observe in both occupying zones, because they also talk about unified collective identity, and also the discourse of hijacking caregiver is very, very serious in both Hamilton and especially Mongkok. So that's why they only talk about democratic issues, but other issues agenda are excluded into occupying zones. So covering are still observed. And the second question is talk about the new strategy that adopted by the Hong Kong LGBT activists. Definitely, we do not have any hope to have democracy in the future, because the oppression from the Beijing government and also the limitation of our freedom. And it seems like a deadlock for LGBT movement if we hold the discourse of no democracy and no equality. So the frustration of the failure of Hong Kong Umbrella Movement affects both Umbrella Movement participants and also LGBT participants. But we can see that there is some new parties or new people working in a new strategy, just like the business organization, the international one, just like Goldsmith and also JP Morgan's. That international organization, they publicly urged the Hong Kong government to have anti-discrimination ordinance to protect LGBT people. The agreement is that the LGBT unfriendliness, especially in policy, for example, the dependent visa and also the tax reduction, really affect their work to attract global elites from all over the world. So they want the government to provide a friendly environment for business to invest their work. And also HSBC publicly paints their icon lion into rainbow to support LGBT equality. And that one is one strategy that to push Hong Kong government, especially Hong Kong, are so proud of itself to be a financial international city, something like that. So it have effect, but you can say that the homonormativity are evenly exaggerated in that new strategy. And also there's another strategy is through the judicial review, which especially after Taiwan we have the same-sex marriage now in the next 2 years through the judicial review. Also Hong Kong people want to try this strategy. We have two judicial review, QT case and also Angus case, is talking about the dependent visa issues and also tax deduction and also same-sex couple rights benefits in the Hong Kong government. So using judicial review can be also another way to avoid politics and to fight for same-sex couple rights.
Thanks to the questions. Thanks to the questions. To understand the so-called Southerners and rurality in this study, in this fieldwork, well, it has to be opposed. It has to be putting in opposition to urbanness here. Well, I do interviews and studied loads of gay fans from urban areas like in Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Wuxi. Well, they all tend to be quite similar to all of those already studied urban gay men, and being able to consume your opera is only a part of their daily lives. They might think that going into the theatre to listen to the traditional opera is a privilege. It's it's a way of saying, oh, I'm so educated, I'm able to understand those non-daily languages and stuff like that. But when I mention rural, especially, it is, well, geographically, it is all of those gay parties. They were all held in rural areas. For example, I traveled from Hangzhou to a teeny tiny town, I'd say, through this urban rural shuttle, and then you have to take a local tricycle to get to another place, and then you have got to sort of ask for roads and stuff like that to find that ancient stage in the middle of that country. And all of those audience over there, they were all really old and sort of left behind, and most people, they can't speak fluent Mandarin. So that's what I mean by really rural, because I suffered a lot getting there, and also being on site can be a really sort of difficult experience for me as well, because I realized that when I finished 2 days observation and then returned into to Hangzhou city, I didn't go back home. I found a bar and sipped some IPAs from there, and then I realized, oh, I'm not at all rural anymore, even though I was born in a rural area. So and then in terms of southern, well, first of all, this Yue opera, it has been called a southern opera compared to Peking opera, and then it has been performed in Zhenzhong dialect. It's a sort of local dialect outside of Hangzhou city. So this group of gay men, they also sang opera in this very precise Zhenzhong dialect, and they communicated with each other with some sort of Zhejiangese accent as well. So I think that can explain how I would define them as southern. These are all geographical meanings, and then when it comes to the cultural, well, these people, especially this gay rural gay fans, they don't have so many alternatives other than heterosexual marriage compared to their counterparts in the urban area. In the urban area, those gay men, they can have like 新婚, they can find a lesbian partner and things like that. But in the rural area, they're exposed to their parents' pressure, and they are living quite close to older generations and things like that. So that's the social parts of my explanation. And then secondly, when it comes to the historical and the modern interaction, and how these rural gay men, they witness this huge spectrum between young and old. Well, when I interviewed all of these people, they also reflect loads of opinions on the development of Yue opera per se, and through their expectations of the future of Yue opera, you can actually see how the tradition meets modernity, and how they feel this kind of tension and anxiety when they are trying to continuously linger on this kind of tradition art. Most of the people, they believe that Yue opera has changed because those professional tropes, they are adopting some other new forms of Yue opera performing and make it more sort of like 话剧, ordinary sort of it's sort of more sort of westernized opera performing way, and it's not at all old-fashioned anymore. It's no longer 才子佳人. It's no longer the scholar loving a lady, a prudent lady, or something like that. It's sort of modernized, and loads of people see that as no longer Yueju anymore. And then loads of people, they are not at all optimistic about the future of Yue opera, saying, well, because of the development of because of the development of different kinds of culture today, and younger people have more choices nowadays, and then they wouldn't necessarily choose Yue opera to start with. But I'm glad to see that there are still some young people performing this, and they are enjoying their identity when they interact with each other. So So I'm trying to sort of find whether this is a contingent stuff or a necessary stuff. Thank you.
Sabiha, would you like to respond to anything? No?
Actually, I have a question for Zhenzhong,
All right.
because I'm very intrigued. You pay attention to the geographical and physical surrounding of these operas. You tell us about the street vendors and the hotel owners. Maybe I'm being curious because in Lebanon there are similar kinds, of artistic gathering for self-identified gay men who also, where I would say inflated, let's say, gender performance. They exaggerate the makeup, the dresses, and this and that. They dance belly dancing, which is usually associated with men, etc. Anyway, my question is, how was the reaction of the vendors and the hotel owners, or I'm trying to think about homophobia as such. Did they turn a blind eye for the sake of income? Or were these places, thoroughly searched for their, gay friendliness, etc.?
Thank you, Sabiha. 2 more questions. There's one question here and one question there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alberto from Central European University, and my question is also for Zhenzhong, because you started your presentation talking about desire and libido, and then you moved on to talk about identity and say that your interviewees are self-identified gay men that are closeted. I don't know to what extent they are self-identified or not, and I'm wondering what's the implication of they identifying or not, and how they and we understand their sexuality, if it's a kind of a consolidation of their desire into an identity that for us would then give meaning to their lives somehow, or if they see it as contingent in that moment when the UA opera setting is ready. And that's my question pretty much. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question here, please.
I'm Skylar from King's College London. I have a question that I think might sort of kind of connect some of the themes across the papers, so maybe a few of you would like to speak to it. I was really struck by something coming out of fandom studies, which is a very kind of now old line, I think from Henry Jenkins, about my weekend-only world. In my weekend-only world, and it's the description of the kind of the old-school fan convention, the Star Trek convention or whatnot that fans attend, and for so many people that having been a space of sexual alterity, particularly in Western fandoms for Slash fans, but for yaoi fans in manga and anime conventions and whatnot. Now, that temporality of the weekend-only world, I think, I was reminded strongly of it when you were talking about these parties and the going to the party, but there's also something about it that reminds me of there's something in the temporality of the marriages in Lebanon that you're talking about that has a quality of something interspersed, a queerness that's interspersed with a sort of normative temporality of life, and that's such a contrast to the Hehe culture with these two activists who are being portrayed on social media as not as something that is kind of lifted out of a temporality of the everyday into a kind of weekend onlyness, but is completely suffused in the kind of work of the activism. I'm just wondering if there's a way that you might all be interested in talking about that temporality, the way that time is being kind of divided up differently or is being used differently, and what the implications of that are.
Thank you. So, 1 minute each for all the panelists here. And should we start with Sabiha? Is that all right? Yeah? All right, great.
I think it's a very interesting question. And, like the more recent literature in queer studies, whoever has examined time, right? They really do it they pay attention to the whole capitalist system in which we live. Everything is sort of organized towards maximum productivity. If the nuclear family is going to serve this maximum productivity, let it be, hence, reinforcing the myth of father, mother, children, etc. So, yeah, for example, Munoz would say time is straight, right? Both literally and figuratively. Or like this Freeman lady talks about chrononormativity. And actually, I mean, the extension of the analysis would say maybe we should approach agency as something that's temporal. And really, when you want to look at sexuality, heteronormativity, heterosexuality, all these different notions that are clearly sometimes conflate, sometimes it doesn't work. Who cares, how we define them, how we approach them? Maybe we should, start to think about things as being temporal. So, yeah, it's not about being able to survive or not. Maybe I can in the here and now. Maybe I cannot in the here and now. And you never know, right? Like, you build alliances in unexpected places, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, this was the case, for example, of non-conventional love, because a lot of their friends and families had to also bend the rules, and they found allies with the most unexpected people. Yeah, fluidity again, ambivalence, this is how I would approach it.
Thank you, Sabiha. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you to all the questions and comments. First of all, to answer how straight people reacted to gay party members. Well, I think, first of all, because these people, they performed opera, and then they sort of tried to strategize their freedom in an operatic way. So maybe those street vendors would regard them as art performers only, instead of thinking too much into it. And then to answer, how did they identify themselves? Before any interviews, I would ask them whether they would consider themselves as gay or tongzhi. There's one person saying, "Oh, I used to do those kind of things, but I no longer do it." So okay, now you are not identifying yourself as a gay man, then I'm not going to interview you. So that's sort of a ethical stuff that I have to consider before I interview anyone. So yes, indeed, all of those people that I studied, they have identified themselves as gay or tongzhi. And finally, to respond the comments on temporality, queer temporality. I think first of all, I only introduced the offline sphere of these gay fans activities, and actually online on for example Tencent QQ or on WeChat, we do had establish a new WeChat group after our first meeting, first party, and those people are quite active in there. And so to me, it's no longer just a temporary thing for them to relate to opera, but also a quite continuous stuff and self-strengthening kind of thing when they keep talking about opera, when they keep talking about cross-gendered arts. And also, when I interviewed all of those people, how they fell in love with opera, all of them reminded themselves of their childhood experience. So to me, to these people, love of opera or queering, starting to queer opera, perhaps emerged when they were really young. So yes, temporality, it can be a quite overt feature of this group of gay men when it comes to agency. But when it comes to their passion and their relation to this kind of traditional arts, and how they queer this, how they appropriate this, it goes back into a long time, I think.
Thank you. Eliz.
Thank you for your questions and comments. First, I respond to the queer culture in Asia, which actually you're right that in the Western culture, just like the ones spoke about ADS UP, which is talk about AIDS campaign in the US, which we can see that they proudly adopted the queer identity and also use this as a counter public. But in Asia, it seems that it's not the same case, especially in the umbrella movement, because the whole setting of the umbrella movement is from the trigger point is from the student leaders, which they have the glorified image of being moral superior, the self-sacrifice, something like that. So the moral standard set in the occupying zone is so high, and also why I use the concept covering, which is not only talk about individual level but also a macro level, how covering become a cohesive nature that people need to adopt to the norms to cover their sexual identity. And about the queer temporality, yeah, you're right. It's very interesting that the Hehe culture seems like to contradict with the various, just like the marginalized group or the invisible group of talk about fandom or also a gay community. I think it is mainly because, and also the Hehe culture, the terms Hehe and also boys love, is the first time to appear in the mass media after in the umbrella movement, and also the effect continues. Now the terms Hehe are used by the LGBT activists and also the common public to refer to LGBT community. So now it's become terms which adopted by the wider public, and also it's also draw on the image of a positive student leaders and also desexualized and destigmatized image. I think the main reason is the endorsement of the student leader. They do not treat it as a stigmatized label but proudly take it, and also the mass media like this trick because it's eye-catching. Two handsome guys having romantic relationship and having a little bit jokes, some jokes, and then it helps the whole vocabulary and the culture happen in umbrella movement and also later in the Hong Kong society.
Thank you, Eliz. I now close the